I wanted that story to be a little cautionary tale, as much for me as for anybody else, to remind us that when we're sinking in the water, when we're aware of the storms around us, it is not our jobs to be the ones who walk on the water. When things get difficult or discouraging or even dangerous, we're not the ones to walk out on the water. We're in the boat. We're in the boat with God's people, and it is Christ who comes to deliver us. So that story is just meant to be a little bit of preventive medicine against sliding into the pastoral fantasy. What I'd like to do with the rest of this time is to offer a few way markers, a few signposts that I think can help us to remain in effective ministry and courageous leadership in dangerous times and over the long term. I'm really interested these days, like Roger is, in resilience, but also in longevity. I think it's really important for us to encourage one another, to support each other, to pray for each other, to be honest with each other in the interests of longevity in pastoral ministry. Even in times of threat or challenge, in times of danger and uncertainty, I think that we can continue to lead as ones who take our lead from one who will not fail or forsake us. We can strive toward health and wholeness. We can practice some practices that keep us walking in a good way. The first one is playfulness. I don't know if that's at the top of your list, but it's at the top of my list today. Ministry can become, and sometimes it needs to be, a very earnest business. Some things, of course, must be taken with great care and seriousness. But not everything. One of the sure signs of toxic systems and organizational anxiety is the evacuation of humor. Have you noticed that? When things get very tight and stressed, humor gets erased, or only inappropriate humor is expressed. When everyone loses their sense of humor, you know there's trouble. In those situations, look, I know that a measure of decorum is to be maintained, especially those of us who have come somehow through the Presbyterian tradition. But the court jesters and the tricksters and the storytellers and artists also really need to come alive in those times. Another side of playfulness is noticing the paradoxes and strangeness of life. A few weeks ago, I was thinking about what I might say at this event. I was trying to think through a little bit of what I might want to talk about, and I was trying to tease out the dynamic of leadership where in pastoral ministry, quite often we are simultaneously called upon to put out fires and to light fires. Like, you have to deal with the troubles and the conflicts and the anxieties and the things that are kind of carrying on and going in a bad way. That's putting out fires. And then sometimes there's lethargy or inaction, or you want to inspire and motivate people. You have to light fires. So I was kind of thinking about that paradox a little bit. I was trying to find a good catchphrase for that. I haven't got one yet. So if you have one, please, I will give you a shiny nickel for it, or at least a handshake. Anyway, I was mulling this over one night in my car, trying to think about, like, how do we talk about this balance between lighting fires and putting out fires? And I was waiting, parked downtown beside a sidewalk, waiting for my son. I was going to pick him up and drive him home. And these three guys were sitting on the sidewalk, covered with a blanket, and they were laughing and carrying on. And I wasn't really paying much attention. And then they started yelling at me from their place on the sidewalk up against the wall through my open window and over top of the news that I thought I was listening to. And they say, hey man, can you help us? And I looked over, and they were super happy and relaxed. And I said, yeah, like maybe, I don't know. And they held up their sign, their cardboard sign, It said, please help. This was written on their big piece of card. Please help. We lost all our weed in a series of small fires. And, this is Halifax, baby. People stop and we're giving them money. I'll leave it to you to decide how you incorporate. I'm hoping you'll tell me later, actually, how you might incorporate goofiness and playfulness into your ministry. But I always love a really goofy story. And one of my favorite stories, maybe you've heard it before, is about a woman who was coming into her older ages of life, and her 3 grown sons wanted to honor her with a special birthday. None of them lived with her. None of them lived in the same community anymore. They all had moved away. And although they grew up very poor, these 3 grown sons had done very, very well for themselves. They had really prospered, and they wanted to treat their mother with the best possible gifts they could imagine. She had lived with very modest means her whole life. So one of them bought this enormous house for her, giant house full of servants and furnishings and everything she could possibly want and more. And the second son bought her this beautiful, beautiful limousine and a driver who would take her anywhere she wanted 24 hours a day. And the third son thought, I don't know how I can beat that. But he said, I'll think about it. And he discovered that there was this parrot that had been trained by monks on Mount Athos in Greece. And the parrot had been trained to recite the whole Bible. And she was a very devout woman. And he thought, this is great. It's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars to get this parrot, but he bought it for her. It cost a fortune to get it in. He had to smuggle it into the country, set her up with this parrot. Well, about a month later, she thought she better get in touch with her sons and thank them for these very extravagant gifts. She wrote to the first son. She said, son, I love this house. It is beautiful, but it is far too big for me. I'm constantly getting lost. I don't know where I am, and I don't know who all these people are who are trying to help me. I don't think I'm going to keep the house. She wrote to the second son and said, this limousine you've arranged for me is unbelievable. But to be honest, I don't go out very often, and when I do, it's usually with Mabel, and she's always taken me shopping, and I really miss my time with Mabel. I don't think I'm going to keep the car. And then she wrote to her third son, and she said, you were always the practical one. That chicken was delicious. I don't know. It's all out there. That material's all out there. Don't be afraid to bring it in. Where you can, bring in the playfulness. This one's a little more serious, maybe. I think twice a year it's important and helpful for us to sit down and, not during a crisis time, but twice a year sit down with yourself and write out a few goals, big ones and small ones. What are you hoping for? What are you planning for? Where do you feel led personally, professionally, for the church, for your family, for the community? And how are you going to prioritize those goals? And not to worry too much at that point whether they're attainable or if there's something that you absolutely have to figure out in advance. I think at this moment in the church's life, we need lots of dreamers. We need lots of people who will aspire to things that have not yet happened. And on a separate page, at the same time, in the same season, a couple times a year, I think it's helpful also to write down some limits that you know about yourself. Physical limits, emotional limits, mental, time limits, whatever. And I'm not suggesting that these two lists be indexed to each other. One is not meant to control the other. I don't think we need to be hard-nosed about that. It's really an exercise in awareness. What am I longing for, and what are my limits? Just to kind of bring those things into awareness, to be aware of the realities with which you live. The big picture is very important for us to keep casting, and reality is also important to keep in touch with. Sometimes awareness of our limits goes into kind of an overdrive moment, and I want to tell you a true story about when that happened for me. About 5.5 years ago, I was home, working at home in the afternoon, and I had this experience in my body which was of overwhelming pain in my head. Way beyond anything I'd ever felt. Like order of 10,000 beyond any headache I'd ever had. Like it's not a headache kind of thing. And I physically felt it open inside my brain like a flower. And apparently there's no nerves in your brain, so I don't know how that happened. Anyway, I felt this thing open up in my head with overwhelming pain. I tried to have a nap to sleep it off. I took high-test Tylenol to get rid of it. I took a little walk in the fresh air. Nothing. It wasn't throbbing. It was just like a vice. My head was in a vice. My wife Sally was away. She was in Toronto taking a class. My two boys were younger and they were in school. And I didn't know what to do. I knew I had to go to the hospital. I waited until the boys got home from school and said, I have this really bad headache. I'm going to go talk to a doctor about it. And I went to Emerge. I drove myself. Pro tip, never do that. And anyway, I was in Emerge for a long time, and I called one of our son's closest friends' parent, okay, who also happens to be our MLA, and asked if she could go pick up the boys. And she did. She took them home and kept them overnight. And one of the very beautiful side notes in the story is that our older son, who would have been about 14 or 15 at the time, took his wallet with him in his overnight bag so that he could buy his little brother lunch the next day. Isn't that sweet? It's a sweet touch. Anyway, so I'm in the hospital. This incredible vice is on my head, and they run me through all the scans and tests that they could. And I don't know how many of you would have known Gary Redcliffe, who taught at Emmanuel College. And Gary, just a few months before, had developed an aneurysm and died. And I really loved Gary. And I'm sitting in the hospital emergency room waiting for the results of these tests to come back. And the doc comes back to me and he says, you have an aneurysm, and there's not much we can do. And because it's ER, and he went away again. So I got my phone. I phoned Sally. Hi. I think they told me I have a small aneurysm. And she's walking on the sidewalk in Toronto. I think I have to sit down. So that was a short call. And I called our friends who had our boys and said, I think you're going to need to keep them overnight. And then I put the phone down. And I was absolutely taken up with this wave and this sensation. This is how it ends. Today is the day I'm going to die. It was like a slow motion movie. This is the moment. It's over. I wasn't afraid of dying. I felt reconciled with God, but I was profoundly sad for my family. So I did learn that day why people become addicted to Percocet. Really hardcore painkiller, right? Didn't do anything for my headache, my head. It wasn't a headache. But boy, I felt fantastic. And I was really funny on Percocet. Was transferred to another hospital, another whole suite of exams and tests, and none of the specialists who treated me could figure out what was wrong or how to treat it. The second MRI, they said, it's not an aneurysm. And I hadn't died, right? I was still alive, test after test after test. I was lying in bed in the hospital. I had to be absolutely still after one of the procedures for like 6 hours or something. And I was lying there thinking, and I thought, so I didn't die. What now? And I'll tell you, coming up to that point of being at your absolute limit, like the finality of my mortality, really woke me up. I thought I was an existentialist before. Now I really am. How am I going to live from this point on? My existential crisis, that real profound conviction that I was going to die that day, reminded me of the limitations of my body and the costliness of the stress that I had chosen for myself. And it reminded me of the things that matter most. And I think awareness, I don't want any of you to have any kind of experience like that, but awareness of our limits helps to remind us and focus on what matters most. I can't do everything. I can't be everything. I can't walk on water. I can't save the church. There are real limits, but there are some things I can focus on. There are a few things that I can do well. There are a few things to which I am called. And I think becoming aware of our limits and honoring our limits helps us to get focused on those things. Number 3 is taking care of our bodies, which is related, right? You might know that sketch by Leonardo da Vinci called The Vitruvian Man. So it's sort of an experiment in anatomy. So this cat's got his beer belly and his boxer shorts and his knobbly knees. And I think he's got a remote and a bottle of wine and a PlayStation controller and maybe a can of beer, a can of soda. And I think he looks pretty happy. So I don't know if he's taking care of his body, but there is, I think, a real call to us in what is still an age of defying death and a denial of the body. We are still in that post-Augustinian age. I think there's a new call for us to take care of our bodies in a way that will help us to persevere and be sustained for longevity in ministry. Paying attention to what we eat, and I'm just going to say, I'm not proposing myself as a model for this one. I'm just aware of it, and I know it's something that I'm also trying to work on. One of the things I'm really encouraging these days is that people go outside. Just be in fresh air. Go outside. Go outside. And delight in the oxygen and the trees and a little bit of walking or a little bit of whatever you do outside, or finding a way to swim or something that will get the body moving and take in the oxygen that our cells need. But also that gives us the space. Was it Roger this morning talking about the cognitive pause? Was that his phrase? The space also to reflect and process the big questions and also kind of to release them sometimes. Physical well-being, self-care, graciousness towards our own bodies is about that thing Paul talked about in terms of honoring the temple that God has given us and allowing this vessel of flesh in all of its limitations to do what it's meant to do to praise God. I don't know how often we think about that in the contemporary West or in the Protestant West, that our bodies are meant to praise God as well. This one's a little bit harder to work through. It's been harder for me to work through. And the only way I've been able to talk about it, to think about it so far, is respecting a cycle in a ministry lifetime. A cycle that moves between ambition and humility. And I don't want to absolutely map it onto what I was talking about yesterday with the theology of glory and the theology of the cross. I'm not quite talking about that. I'm thinking about kind of the the good and healthy ambition that desires the kingdom of God. The good and healthy ambition that desires the fruitfulness and well-being and abundant life that Jesus desires for us. That kind of ambition, the way in which we are drawn to serve for the greater glory of God, drawn to serve for the greater good of a larger number of people, the things that draw us out of ourselves in a good and healthy way so that others may prosper. Sometimes we think about it as wanting to make an impact. Sometimes it's about wanting to find a way to be aligned with places, congregations that are doing well. Sometimes we admire them and look to them as inspirations. But at the same time, there's another kind of swing in that pendulum or in that cycle where we are brought low. We lose our enthusiasm. We get tired out and discouraged, and sometimes we're tempted to withdraw. And then I think the cycle turns again. For some people, it's a very long cycle. For others, it's short. Sometimes we need a little help or intervention to turn it around again. But I think that these are cyclical patterns in a long-term ministry that we don't need to judge. We don't need to be harsh on ourselves about these, any more than we would be judgmental towards the autumn for following the summer. These cycles just come and they go. And we don't need to judge ourselves about having more or less energy in a given season. These cycle around, and God can use us and bless us and work through us in every season. Every season has its charms in nature. Every season in our lives has a way in which God can work through us. So we don't need to judge it or be too harsh on ourselves and realize that these are often cyclical things. Dostoevsky wrote this exceptionally long novel called The Brothers Karamazov. Anybody read it? I finally read it. Holy crap, it took me like 3 years. I finally read it. Great book. In the 4th chapter, one of the characters says, "You will burn and burn out. You will be healed and come back again. And I will wait for you." I would like to believe that this is very much a word that God would have us hear, that God also waits for us and accompanies us in that. But I would also like us to internalize that thing Roger was talking about, the third person self-regard, to say to yourself, I will wait for you. And to let that cycle turn when it does. This one's not really a mystery to anybody. Staying in touch with God is kind of obvious. These ancient practices of devotional prayer, Bible reading, journaling, meditation, fasting, keeping Sabbath, dream interpretation, a variety of practices that we could use to keep in touch with God are tremendously steadying forces in our lives. They're like the tree roots underneath the surface of the soil that anchor us when trouble and danger and storms come along. These practices get us down into the soil of our souls and hold us there. It doesn't mean the storms aren't going to come, but it means that maybe the tree can bend and sway and give a little bit because the anchor of the roots is still there. The storm's not going to knock us right over. There's a true story about a woman of God from Cape Breton Island. She was the kind of like the mother superior of her religious order. They didn't call her that, but that was kind of the idea. And she was coming towards the end of her life. She was, as they say, dying of old age. And she was lying in her bed for quite some time, unable to do very much for herself. And the sisters in the community were really trying to help her out and come to her aid with whatever she needed. And in the last hours, they said, "Mother, is there anything we can get you?" And she said, "Oh, I would love a cup of milk." So they went and got her a cup of milk and put a shot of whiskey in it. And a couple hours went by, and she kind of was dozing and falling asleep, and they wondered if she was slipping away, but she woke again, and she was quite bright, and they said, "Mother, is there anything we can get for you?" And she said, "I think I'd like a cup of milk." So they went off to the kitchen and got her a cup of milk, and they put 2 shots of whiskey in it. A couple hours went by, and she dozed, and she was really clearly slipping away into the next world. She could just get a few breaths in. Her eyes were closed, and she just kind of opened them a little and said, "I think I'll say goodbye." And the sister said, "Mother, is there any last advice you can give us?" She said, "Don't get rid of that cow." Wait for the Lord. This is about keeping in touch with God. Wait for the Lord. Be strong. Let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. Staying in touch with God, staying grounded in your source, staying grounded in your hope and your goal and your final end, talking things out with God, yelling at God a little, or just waiting on God, delighting in her presence with you and not trying to fix anything or figure anything out. This is a deep practice that offers us consolation and joy and reassurance and forgiveness. It is a calm in a stormy sea. In the midst of the dangers that beset us, God is a sure and steady help. The spiritual disciplines of our tradition help us to stay focused in what matters: vocation, purpose, the Holy Spirit's mission, gratitude for what God has done. Staying in touch with your people is, I think, actually a spiritual practice. It's like part of the job, I know. But there's a way in which when trouble comes, when danger comes, when the storms come, there is often a challenge or a temptation, I should say, to retreat from our people. Now, this is more pronounced among the I's, right? The introverts. Any introverts in the room? I am one. It is a little bit more pronounced for the introverts to withdraw. And there's a temptation to retreat from our people, or when we are angry with them, or frustrated, or discouraged, or frustrated with the way they have handled things, or we're just sad. Finding emotional and physical distance sometimes really seems necessary, but there can be too much of it. And I think it is damaging to the long-term health of a pastoral relationship if we maintain physical and emotional distance for too long. Gary Redcliffe, whom I mentioned earlier, of blessed memory, used to have this little mantra: define yourself and keep in touch. It's okay to say what you believe and who you are and what you think is right, and even maybe to get into it with folks a little bit, but that doesn't mean cut off. It doesn't mean giving up on the relationship. Stay in touch, he said. Keep in touch. Define yourself. Keep in touch. Even in their imperfections, the people that God has sent us to work with can steady us and support us. And it is my conviction that God sends us into these communities to serve them and love them, and therefore also God is somehow sending them to us. It would only make sense that God would also send them to love us. At least a few of them will love us. And some of them will even pray for you if you ask them to. Getting towards the end, it's important to shed Saul's armor. The cartoon, David saying, "Thanks, do you have anything in a 32 Slim?" You know the story. David goes down to fight Goliath, and they try to put him in Saul's armor, and it's just far too big for him, and he can hardly move. And he has to drop it. He has to let go of all that armor. We're not called to wear Saul's armor. We are called into our situation. We're called to serve with the tools that God has given us, among the people God has given us. to do what we are meant to do. There's no rhyme or reason or purpose or plan to try to imitate someone else's gifts, someone else's armor, someone else's circumstances, someone else's call. Another way of saying this, is bloom where you're planted. I think it's okay for us to say, that armor doesn't fit me. But I do have these other gifts. I do have these other things that I'm able to do. I do have this other calling. And that's also a gift. Brian McLaren, whom I've really enjoyed reading the last few years, recently wrote, McLaren says, I admit it. I spent most of the 1980s and early 90s wishing I could just be like Bill Hybels or Rick Warren or John Maxwell. They were successful. They appeared unflinchingly confident. They were powerful, knowledgeable, larger than life. I'd go to their seminars and return home feeling wildly inspired and terribly depressed. Because, he said, I was trying to be them. So just sort of a last couple things that I think are related to that. And that's to try to get clear on the heart of the matter. Roger yesterday was helping us think about our core purposes, the six word purposes. I like that exercise. And this is kind of related to it. Knowing what it is that lies at the heart of your ministry, at the heart of your purpose as a servant leader, is a very sustaining thing. It's something that helps the longevity of ministry if you're clear about what the heart of the matter is. One way that I would phrase it is like this, that ministry leadership is a quest to reveal the love of God. And this is how leaders glorify God. So it's not a possession. It's not something we own or control. And I think for many of us, it's certainly not even something we've arrived at. But it is a quest. It's a quest, a pilgrimage, a journey, a process in which we seek to reveal the love of God. And that task of revealing the love of God is how we glorify God. Do you remember, again, the theology of glory, the theology of the cross? The theology of glory would say Christ is the means to our ends. The theology of the cross would say we are the means to Christ's ends. The quest or the pilgrimage to reveal the love of God is always pointing toward that which God is doing. The way in which God is the one who comes to us in Jesus Christ across the water and reaches out a hand and says, "Be not afraid." That's the direction we are pointing. So what I'd like to do is just leave this last verse with you and the cow, because I'm really into the cow today. God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and love and self-discipline. I think this nicely draws together some of the things I've been saying. There's some time for conversation, and then at the end I'd like to tell you one more story. I'm going to share one final story, and then I think we're going to worship, right? Is that what's happening next? Yeah. So you may know this story. Tom Long tells this story, and I tell it a little bit differently than he does, but it's the same story. It's a true story, and it's about a local church that wanted to put on a dinner theater. Well, not a dinner theater, a theater production. They wanted to use their hall for a stage show, and they decided that they would put on a production of A Christmas Carol. And it really was a great motivator for the whole congregation to come together and get involved. Some were, designing tickets and selling them, and some people were doing promotion, and some people were working up the script, and some were rehearsing lines, and some got together and hammered and painted these really neat sets that would go on the stage in the church hall. And the sets were the kind where it's just like a sheet of plywood that's been strutted up, and then the exterior was painted to look like a street scene from Victorian London. So you kind of have the picture. There's a couple of houses or businesses that rise up and appear to look like two-story buildings, and then a center space in the stage for the rest of the action. And one of the challenges they had in this production is whom they would cast as Scrooge. And I think the minister was the director of this play, and, that probably was the minister's first mistake. But the second mistake is, how am I going to cast Scrooge? Well, they decided Scrooge was going to be a retired school principal who was, I guess, kind of Scroogey. So typecasted. And anyway, he was involved. He kind of went along and learned his lines and came to rehearsals and did the thing. But at the very end of the play, the way they set up the script, Scrooge climbed up to the second-story window behind one of the facades of the set, and they had this door or a window that would swing open. And he climbed up this kind of rickety scaffolding and ladder thing, and he's up there, and this is how the end of the play goes. He opens up the window, and he has to send a gift over to the Cratchit family as a sign of his open-heartedness and love and transformation, as it is in the story. And he leans out the window, and in order to send this package over to the Cratchit family, he needs a messenger boy to take it for him. And he says, the line is, "I need a boy! I need a boy!" And I guess this is how the play was going to end, and everyone would clap and see how Scrooge had been transformed and changed. Well, the last night of the production, they did the same thing every night. They had the same routine, and Scrooge is climbing up there. And they had rows of chairs lined up in the church hall for the audience, and it was a full house. It was closing night, and right in the corner here at the aisle was an 8-year-old boy. And he was spellbound by this play. He thought it was amazing. It was so cool, and he knew some of the people on the stage, and he loved the sets, and he was totally into the story. Totally into the story. And this is the last scene in the play, right? Scrooge climbs up to the second story, and he leans out and he says, "I need a boy! I need a boy!" And this kid in the front row stands up and walks up on stage like this. He says, "Do you mean me, sir?" And this, I guess, cranky actor hustled down the rickety ladder and scaffolding behind the set and ran out to the front of the stage to meet this child and knelt down beside him, off script now, right? And put his arm around him and said, "Yes, you are the very one I need." I have become convinced that this is a little parable of the moment in which we find ourselves. You are the very ones God needs. You are the very ones God needs in this moment. It might be a little bit off script. It might not be quite how things were expected to go. But this is the moment to step into the story and say, "Do you mean me?" Because you are the ones God needs. Thanks be to God.